All right, welcome once again to Seattle Here and Now on Rainier Avenue Radio.world. Continuing this monthly series on hate groups and hate crimes. I have a very special guest, and I mean seriously, a very special guest, someone who I've got to know and do some work with when I was with the Department of Justice, James Ritter. Call him Jim Ritter. He's the LGBTQ Liaison from the Seattle Police Department. He is a police officer with the Seattle Police Department. He also runs the Police Museum, correct? You still?
Correct.
And Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John.
I'm going to introduce Carly Summers, my co-host. Carly, please introduce yourself.
Hi, great to be here again.
Yep. Carly has been so kind to work with me on this piece. We kind of went over the show format, and there's so much information to be covered, so we can't just do it in one show. We're going to have to invite you back again, Jim, because this is Transgender Week, correct?
That's correct.
And there's an issue there, and having done some work in that area, Jim and I worked on this program, and he's going to mention it and talk about it in depth. Safe Place, great program. I mean, it was, I guess it's just fate. We ran into each other, I guess, wasn't it?
It is.
Several years ago. So anyways, let me begin. Again, the basis for the show, and I guess the reason for the show, and I shouldn't say reason or rationale. As you know, there have been a number of incidents across the country. There have been a lot of anti-gay issues that have been coming up. There have been some hate crimes, the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh and the shooting in Louisville at the Kroger. I said, well, I think I just got, and I had it in conference and consultation with my co-host. I said, let's do this. Spend the whole month talking about hate groups, hate crimes. The follow-up show on the 26th, we'll talk about hate groups, the ones that we know a lot of the information from local law enforcement, but also Southern Poverty Law Center, which keeps track of these things. But I wanted to bring Jim in to talk about his career path and the things that he does with the Seattle Police Department as the LGBTQ liaison, but also talk again about the program specific, Safe Place, which is a great program. And so let me begin. Jim, when we talked about coming on the show, I wanted to at least get your kind of input about where your background is and how you got into this in this profession. I mean, becoming law enforcement is one thing, and I gave you kind of a rundown and tell us about how you got in law enforcement. Was there someone that inspired you, kind of thing? But then I wanted to also mention that, as you have said, there was a time when an openly gay individual could not find employment within law enforcement. I mean, that has to be something that has to be, again, that's the short history. And I know about Stonewall and all of the other incidents across the country. And but it is refreshing, and Carly will agree that it is refreshing to know that at least in the Seattle Police Department, you are the LGBTQ liaison. So, yeah.
That's great. Well, I'll be happy to share you a little bit about my life, and that I'm 57 years old. I was born and raised in Bellevue, just east of Seattle here. The diversity in the early 60s in Bellevue was not that great. I think I had 2 African-American kids in my school, all throughout my school years. Didn't know any gay people at the time. Recognized that I was gay even at a young age. I was different than a lot of the other kids. My interest in policing took place like a lot of younger males, especially in my generation in the 60s. You know, we grew up watching Adam 12 and all the police shows. So that was our vision of what cops were. Plus, I saw the police driving around my neighborhood. I would be laying in my bed at night, listening to the sirens, wondering where they were going. It was kind of exciting. So as I got older, I thought, God, being a policeman would be a really, really cool thing to do. So, I would daydream in class like a lot of kids in the era, doodle, what I did, throughout the class sometimes, police cars and other things. And then when I got to be about 13 years old, I was playing with one of my friends whose dad was a police officer in Bellevue. And I'd never met a real live police officer before. And I told him about my interest in this profession. And he said, well, you should come out and go on a ride along with me. So at 14 years old, I went out on a ride along with him. It was probably one of the most exciting things I'd ever done in my life to that point. I got to go in this police car, and I saw the inside of the car and all the lights and the sirens and everything like that, and actually heard the radio traffic. So I went out on the night shift. My parents would let me go out all night long without getting in trouble, which I thought was great. And so I shadowed him for an 8-hour shift and recognized just, wow, there's a lot more than the police do than I ever expected. At that point, he told me about the Police Explorer, the police cadet program in Bellevue. Joined that, spent 4 years doing that, working around the officers and having a uniform and doing non-enforcement stuff, which got my interest even more piqued. However, I realized based on the conversations I had with some of the officers that, me being gay would be preclusive from allowing me to be an officer back in the early to mid 70s. There were still laws on the books that the departments would ask the question on the polygraph. And if you answered in the affirmative, if you were gay or lesbian, then you would be, politely dismissed from the process.
Man, that's incredible. But your parents are very smart. They had you riding along in a police car late at night and you were a teenager. That's
right. Hey,
doesn't
get much better than that.
That's very good.
Well, tell us a little bit more, if you can, about what you just spoke about the question being asked. It's on the polygraph and you're excused from the process. How has that changed?
Well, when I heard this, it was disappointing to me, and I wasn't out yet. I didn't come out until I was 32 years old for just that fear. So I went to my homeroom in high school and went to the career center trying to look for other careers that I wanted to do less than police work, but realized there's no way that I could get into it because I would have to lie my way into it. I'm not a very good liar, so I wouldn't pass the polygraph. The laws eventually changed. And my first police job was in 1980 as a deputy sheriff in a small department in Eastern Washington, which they didn't have a polygraph, thank goodness. Didn't have to lie about it, but I didn't admit it either. And so I served for 3 years there, fearful that if I had come out, my safety might have been jeopardized by officers not backing me up. And then I got hired by the Seattle PD, which I realized in 1983, they may ask the question. I didn't know, but there's other surreptitious ways of inquiring without asking the specific question on the polygraph. It turned out not to be an issue. They did not ask the question. And I was hired in 1983 and I've been there ever since.
And how has the law changed on that since you've been with the police department?
Well, in the McCarthy era in the 1950s, obviously, it was said that if you were gay, you would present a national security risk. Yeah. My thoughts, even as a kid back then, going, well, geez, it's only a national security risk and you're open to blackmail if you're not out. If you're open about it, then no one can blackmail you, right?
There's no hook on you. Well, and what's ironic? Wasn't Roy Cohen, who was on that team, wasn't he gay? There's some discussion about that.
There's a discussion about a lot of folks who may have been back in that era.
The McCarthy, anti-American hearings or un-American hearings.
Exactly.
That is incredible. And Hollywood was targeted too.
Well, they were. And if you look at a lot of documentaries that just came out this year, you learn about a lot of Hollywood stars who could not be openly gay. They were very talented. They had to live in the closet in order to stay employed.
I'm sorry. You say polygraph to ask you what your sexual orientation preference is. What does it have to do with being able to be a law enforcement officer to serve and protect?
I think in the subculture of policing, just like in the subculture of the military, there is a certain image that people have towards soldiers and cops, and that it's a male-dominated environment. You have to be a type A personality. And that a lot of the stereotypes of LGBTQ folks back in the day did not fit that stereotype. So they automatically excluded you from serving in the military and or the police force.
Well, and we've had Chief Best on the show and had the opportunity to meet with her, which is fantastic. And we talked a lot about the force kind of representing the community, not only in its policing, but also in the representation of the people who serve. So we've talked a lot about that. And I guess that kind of brings us right back to this, what's the system like now? Is the force making efforts to attract people of all types, including from the LGBTQ community? What does it look like?
Well, absolutely. When I first got hired by SPD around the same time that Carmen did in the 1980s, we only had one openly male gay officer. Yeah. He was not on the department very long. He eventually left, and I didn't come out for another probably 8 years after that. And I knew officers that were identifying as LGBTQ, especially a lot of the females, which is an expectation, I think, in this profession with females on the job in this career. But not until Norm Stamper became our police chief did I really start to see things change. Norm admitted publicly about his transgressions when he worked for San Diego PD, and indicated and admitted some of the gay slurs that he used to use. And I thought, wow, that's a big risk he's taking, admitting this. And I had a lot of respect for Norm to admit that. I actually even thanked him for that. And he was the first police administrator I ever came out to. And I think nowadays, we've got probably over 80 LGBTQ officers on the police department, at least. And I'm still finding out every year that even I don't know who all the folks are that identify this way. And there's a few more that aren't out for their own reasons. And I don't think it's because the department is not accepting. I think it's a personal decision that you have one chance to do, and it's all about timing.
Yeah. And I guess, we're talking, obviously, we always say this is a community radio show. So we're very focused on Seattle and our community. How are we comparing nationally, though? How is our PD doing on this? And I'm kind of focused on recruiting right now. We can talk about some of the outreach programs, which there are many of, and I'm sure you're hooked right into all of that or heading them. So, but in terms of recruitment and again, representation on the force and how we are doing on that part of the job, how do we look nationally?
Well, I was the recruiter here in the police department in the late 90s to the early 2000s. And even back then, the department has done an outstanding job of drawing all kinds of folks from across the board on the department, including the LGBTQ community. I think our best recruiters are our own officers. And I think when you have officers, whether they be racial minorities, immigrants, LGBTQ, they're the ones that are actually in the system. They're in the culture, and they're the ones that can honestly say how it impacts them. And they're obviously talking to friends that, are from many of the same groups that have extra confidence. Well, there's already somebody there like me that's doing fine. And that encourages people to apply. I think I've seen more LGBTQ officers apply for the department openly in the last 10 years than I've ever seen in my entire 35 years of the SPD, which is great. We hired our first transgender officer just a couple of years ago.
Well, that's one of the things that's to make the commitment to go into law enforcement. I mean, there is a regimen of testing and background information. Oh man, it's just like when you make that decision, a lot of people get through the system to a point and then they just wash out or for whatever reason. But I think Seattle is ahead. They had openly identified Islamic or Muslim officers. You got a whole realm of individuals who are in law enforcement, officers who reflect the diversity in the community. And I think that's wonderful. I think a lot of what people don't understand is you are a person who may be gay or a person of minority, but you are still an officer. There are policy, procedure, etc., that you have to go through. You go through that training regimen and all of those things. And it does make sense to see people who look like me or who are like me. And that is the thing that attracts. So what, in terms of, and I know they do a lot of outreach, you have resource officers in the schools. Have you gotten feedback from any of the officers out there who talked to some of the kids who are looking into law enforcement who may be gay? Because that is a very hard time for a lot of kids coming out. Middle school, high school. Yeah.
You bet it is. And I think the kids in this generation are probably a lot more sophisticated than the kids back in my day were. They have access to all kinds of information on the internet. They pay attention to certain things. And I think that they recognize that there are people that are openly serving on the Seattle Police Department and other agencies who are like them, including LGBTQ students. This job is not for everybody. And, it's a very invasive backgrounding and hiring process. The money is okay. And I think that the public scrutiny with police in the last couple of years is also a detriment to some folks who think about getting into this, regardless whether they're LGBTQ or not. I think the other thing too is, and I tell a lot of the folks that are identifying as such from the community that I work with, in that, the police culture is that of you need to prove yourself. And it doesn't really matter, especially in our department, whether you're African American or gay or straight or lesbian. If you can't do the job here, you're not going to be accepted. And that is the way this works. And I think a lot of our officers, including our transgender officer, before he came out, wanted to make sure that he was known for being a good police officer first and transgender second.
Right.
And that's the way that I wanted to be seen. That's why it took me, 11 years to do this. I wanted to know what my environment was during a huge transition in this culture. In a police department which was progressive in comparison to other major cities, but still had a ways to go. And unlike somebody who's African American, I could negotiate through the precincts and the locker rooms, in the roll call rooms, and I could really see what the unfiltered impressions were of the LGBT community as a fly on the wall, so to speak.
Man, it had to be interesting.
Well, and I would think that, kids these days would sort of think this is almost a non-issue in their minds. So is there an issue? And this gets into stereotyping, right? It's like that the perception is this is a very sort of macho job to have, and that somehow coming from the LGBTQ community would make that not so. So are these vestiges of a stereotype that are pervasive in the culture of the job, or have we eroded that enough that the kids are right and it's a non-issue?
Well, I'll tell you something. I speak to a lot of school kids, and in the last couple of years, when I speak to high school students, some of them will come up to me and they'll say, "Hey, officer, thanks a lot for talking to us about this stuff, but this is your generation's issues,
Right.
not ours."
Yeah.
And so I took pause at that and I go, you know what? He's right. In that, we're kind of the bridge generation. I mean, when I first got hired, I was around cops that were serving in World War II, a completely different generation, and Korean War vets and like that. And I look at the LGBTQ officers, whether it's in our department or in society in general, with any employment, that was a novelty back in the day. Just like women were a novelty in policing or in the military, just like African Americans or any other minority who is serving in a traditionally all-white environment. The transgender folks right now are the new novelty, and eventually that will cease to become a novelty once society gets educated enough to understand what the differences are and that there's really not that many differences. And that's my perspective anyway.
Well, and we, again, we had Chief Best on and talked a lot about the importance of a diverse policing community, and that that this old idea that this is like this macho job itself is such a bad stereotype for policing, and that we don't really want to have that impression anyway, because we want community policing, right? And the community policing should be done by people who look like us and are like us. And so this increased diversity just makes sense.
Well, it is. I think it's just a natural transition. And, you talk about police stereotypes. I just got back from training officers in Oklahoma and Texas about this very issue.
Right. You told me.
And, I was a little apprehensive, as was the group that I was training for, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, who also recognize that this diversity training is very important to get this information out to jurisdictions which may be isolated, that we all may have stereotypes of. And so when we went down there, I was concerned that, we were right in the middle of the Bible Belt. And here I am talking to my fellow officers about gay stuff, right? And interacting with the LGBT community. My stereotypes were eventually put to the side when I started talking to these folks who readily admitted that they didn't know a lot about this topic. They were oftentimes raised in the same environment that I was. They hear a lot of negative stereotypes. And when you present sensitive social information to some fairly conservative folks, regardless of the profession, it's the way you present that. It's not the information. And once people can recognize that there is some connectivity there, when you ask them to raise their hands as far as how many LGBTQ folks they have in their families or in their community or that they work, they all raise their hands. I mean, but they don't talk about it. So I think talking about it is the icebreaker that society needs. And in these two cases, in both departments that I talked to, I was pleasantly surprised that even my stereotypes, which I probably shouldn't have, but obviously we all do, were laid to rest, at least with these two agencies, that they were more progressive than I ever expected.
Well, I got to give you some inside info. Jim and I were talking before he went down there, and he kind of echoed some of the apprehension he had about going into that. I think, remember, we had breakfast and you're talking about going there, and I'm saying, oh my gosh, this is one courageous dude, because I ain't going out there. I ain't talking about that because I was in Atlanta. Again, it's a kind of it's so interesting. You have an openly gay community there, but you still have that issue of the Bible Belt and the real conservative viewpoint.
Well, what's interesting is the training we gave in Shawnee, Oklahoma was held directly across the street from one of the biggest Southern Baptist universities in the world, which just a few years ago was subject of a lawsuit because they openly prohibited any LGBTQ students from attending this school. So again, you've got different areas that have different viewpoints towards this. We weren't down there to change anybody's mind as far as about their religion, but we did want to open up their minds to what is going on in 2018 in this world, and that there's an easy way to get through this career and profession, and there's a difficult way, and the difficult way is staying stuck by the profession's attitudes from 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I would think, I know that, policing in this era is a tough job for the reasons you said. This may be one of the lesser difficult things we deal with now, right? And that police departments are grappling with this and trying, and people are in there fighting the good fight, trying to. That it's almost like you said, across the street, you may have the literal opposition to this very idea, but the police departments, by and large, are in there kind of getting in the trenches on these kinds of issues and trying to do community policing and be more reflective of the communities they're serving. Has that been your experience as a liaison and getting out into the...
It has been, and I get a lot of phone calls from chiefs and sheriffs from around rural Washington that are understanding that their communities are changing as well. As pressure is being put on Seattle as far as housing, you have more diverse communities moving out into the suburban areas and into the rural areas. People from diverse communities are getting to be retirement age, and they're looking for places to go to retire, and they want to make sure those places are safe for them to be at. So I tell these chiefs and sheriffs and politicians, the safer you make your communities for people that are different, the more benefit you're going to get in the long run. And I think that the fact that we've been getting so many of these phone calls in the last couple of years tells me that they are waking up to the fact that just because they're 100 miles from Seattle doesn't mean they don't need to start thinking about this stuff. And that the quicker they do it before a crisis occurs, the more legitimate it's going to seem.
Yeah. Well, and we spoke with Chief Best when she was here about, and this is kind of my difficult question, if you will. The police department was operating under consent decree on disproportionate use of force against some groups, mostly people of color. And that police department's in compliance now, and there's still some compliance period left. We're working on that, and always something that police departments need to be paying attention to. But so had the consent decree, how are we doing with the LGBTQ community on this? So this is another kind of underrepresented group.
Well, I think that when you look at the report that the monitoring team gave after their first year of being here, after the Safe Place Initiative was launched, that the public support from the LGBT community rose. I believe it was about 22%. Even Chief O'Toole texted me when that information came out, and it was we were very happy to see that level of public trust had increased so much. But it takes work. It doesn't just take work from the police department's efforts. It takes work from the community activist efforts, from the community at large, from the media, from the public officials. I mean, it is not just a one person or a one entity solution.
Definitely. Tell us a little bit more about the kinds of things you're doing here. So we've talked about you've been kind of out there teaching.
Liaison to the LGBT, because when I went to that meeting, I said, wow, that's a well-attended meeting, Go ahead,
What
Jim.
kind of work are you doing?
Well, when I first got up to the community outreach unit in 2014, I was asked by Chief O'Toole to be the full-time liaison, a position we had never had before. It was a very public announcement that she made. It got a lot of media interest. It also got a lot of public interest, and we started getting phone calls almost immediately from the victims of hate crimes, which were asking me why there was such an explosion in hate crimes in Seattle. Well, I recognize that the New York Times did an article in June of 2014 indicating Seattle was one of the highest reporting cities in the nation, and that other cities that were larger than us had 0 reported hate crimes.
Mhm.
Well, that made me scratch my head going, this doesn't make any sense at all, because we're fairly progressive in comparison and much more tolerant of people's differences in Seattle than other places in this country are. So these individuals that called, and there was probably at least a half a dozen folks that said, well, I got assaulted, last week or last month. They were being very specific about the times, the days, locations, injuries, hospitalizations, and their general fears of being assaulted. Well, I had previously collected the reports from 2013 and 14, which didn't match up with their commentary, and it was because they didn't report it. And then I knew we had a problem. That's when we established the concept of the Safe Place Initiative, which gets these people to report more and trust the police and that we're going to do the right thing.
That's a beautiful, we're going to break on the safe place discussion because we're going to go back to it because I think it's a great program. Hey, we're going to wrap up this portion. This is part 1 on Seattle Here and Now with my very special guest, Jim Ritter, Seattle Police Department LGBTQ Liaison. And we're going to wrap it up here. We're going to come back for part 2, and we're going to continue this discussion. And please stay tuned.
This is Paul Pearson, host of Star Time. And when I'm not being reprimanded by traffic cops, I'm listening to RainierAvenueRadio.world.
Mga kaibigan, makinig po kayo sa PhilAm Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, keep listening to PhilAm Radio, broadcasting live every Tuesday at RainierAvenueRadio.world at 1:30 in the afternoon.
Co-hosted by Kuya Bert and Rolly Polintan.
Check out Fresh Juice on Rainier Avenue Radio every Wednesday night, 9 to 11 p.m.
As we bring you the hottest new hip-hop, dope guests, and interviews with artists on the rise.
Plus, you can kick it with me, D-Money, and Evan B. Culture.
Every Wednesday night, 9 to 11 p.m. on RainierAvenueRadio.world. Fresh Juice.
Hello, this is Sage Prince. Are you considering making lifestyle changes? Eating a healthier diet, but you're not quite sure where to start? Well, I can help. Just My Opinion, a music program centered in R&B and hip-hop, but delivered in an organic, free-range music mix, providing you a nutrient-rich listening environment that can improve your mood and overall sense of well-being. So start your healthy lifestyle with healthier listening. Check out Just My Opinion, RainierAvenueRadio.world.
Kind of nonsense conversation are we having here?
The Neon Ghost Show. The Neon Ghost Show. Right here on Rainier. What's it? RainierAvenueRadio.world.
Right about now.
RainierAvenueRadio.world. I'm so tired. I have to pee.
This is Karen Z with RainierAvenueRadio.world, and we want to hear from you. Our goal is to amplify and share the diverse voices of Southeast Seattle residents. Do you know of an engaged community member who should be featured in a community spotlight? Tell us about them. Do you know of an upcoming family-friendly, educational, or cultural event coming up? Tell us about it. If you have news to share, contact us by emailing RainierAvenueRadio.world@gmail.com. Once again, please email us at RainierAvenueRadio.world@gmail.com.
Welcome. We're back for part 2 on Seattle Here and Now on RainierAvenueRadio.world. My very special guest, Jim Ritter, the LGBTQ Liaison from the Seattle Police Department. He also, and we're going to ask him about the police museum later on with my co-host, Carly Summer. Carly.
Hi.
And Jim, thank you very much for coming down. A very busy schedule. You've been, actually, this is one police officer I know has been literally around the world. And we're going to talk about the program Safe Place. But to follow up with what we had discussed and what we left off, I did a little bit of research and found out that there are at least, based on what the Southern Poverty Law Center has shared in their publications, 51 identified anti-LGBTQ organized groups in this country. There is a couple of them in Washington State that we're aware of, that I'm aware of. I think it's a Verity group or something out of Vancouver. I didn't see anything with specific to Seattle, but we know that at one time Mars Church, that church group, Mars, I think it was called Mars Church or whatever, they had some discussion about being, about anti-gay, that kind of thing. So I'm doing a very poor job of relating that, but there have not been at least identified, and that's what I'm going to ask Jim, that he knows about, that are active in Seattle areas. And I'm talking about organized groups that there's really not much we can say about these lone wolf individuals that do these things, these acts. But do we know of any organized active group here in Seattle that I couldn't find anything on? And that's just me.
We monitor these individuals or groups very carefully. To the best of my recollection, there are not any active in the city of Seattle area. I think the last organized effort as far as anti-LGBTQ effort was the Reverend Fred Phelps out of Kansas, who would actively travel to, Washington State and disrupt a number of events. They were the most anti-LGBTQ entity that I was aware of in my lifetime. Since the Reverend passed away, his kids have now taken over, but they are far less effective than they have been. I think public sentiment towards this has been very vocal and has shut a lot of that rhetoric down.
Good. Well, and kind of piggybacking on what John is saying, what we do also know from just the statistics, the numbers we see, is that most of the hate crime that happens is exactly what he's saying we can't really account for. It's that single actor, and it's, after the bar closes, and it's an altercation, and it's mostly against LGBTQ people in the community. So maybe that takes us back to Safe Place. Maybe let's talk about what do we do about this? It becomes the community's job, it seems.
It does become the community job, and it really always has been. When I was younger, when I first got hired here, there were large groups of people that would travel to Seattle for the specific reason of assaulting folks in the LGBT community. As a matter of fact, I stopped a carload of kids up in Volunteer Park in the mid-'80s that contained the kid brother of my best friend, which was a very sobering experience and very disturbing to me. I came from a good family. However, the mentality of the era was that this is what you do. That isn't going on in Seattle anymore. However, we do have a significant number of events involving individuals who still like to assault people because of their differences.
Right.
The Safe Place initiative, when we first started receiving these phone calls from these victims, it was very alarming to me in that the number of incidents reported were not being recorded or reported to the police. And I asked these victims on why they didn't report, and a lot of them weren't necessarily familiar with 911. They thought after they'd been assaulted, there was no longer an emergency. A lot of them were not out yet and did not want to expose their personal lives to their employer or to the media who would pick up on these stories. Some of them didn't necessarily trust the police to care because of they're older from this generation, that the police didn't care in many cases. It didn't really matter to me what the reason for the non-reporting it was. It was the fact that it wasn't being done, and the police department in Seattle couldn't devote resources to trying to get a grip on when these events were happening, who was doing them, et cetera, et cetera. So I remember back when I was a kid about a safety program that I had been exposed to in the 1960s. It was a program designed to let school kids know that the houses along the bus routes were safe to run to should you be followed or harassed by strangers. There was a yellow hand in the window. I searched on the internet high and low and couldn't find any information about it, but I thought, what a great concept. It's simple to understand. The symbolism is evident. So we developed the Safe Place Initiative, where you have a rainbow police shield, and it encourages the victims to report these. We knew we had to collaborate with businesses in Seattle because that's where the majority of these crimes were taking place, was in the commercial business districts. Yeah. So we launched the program in May of 2015. I wasn't really sure how the public was going to react to this. Again, I'm from the 60s. This was not something that was discussed in polite company back in the 60s or the 70s. I talked to a few business owners, a few people that I know from the media. They thought it sounded good, but it had never been done before by a police department promoting victim safety, especially when it comes to the LGBT community. There's always been somewhat of a rift between law enforcement and LGBTQ. You talk about the Stonewall incident and other incidents that have happened over the years. So when the program launched, the media took a significant interest in this, and it was broadcast not only in Seattle, but all over the world, including Japan and the United Kingdom and Germany and Canada. It surprised me. We started not only getting interest from the businesses, who I personally, walked to about 55 of them in 4 hours, and they all signed up for it. They recognized that this was a problem, and that they, as business owners, had an obligation to do something more than just make money in minority communities. This would be a symbol that they were a safe place to go into, where the victims could stay safe until the police got there, and that they would be responsible for calling the police on the victim's behalf. Pretty soon, businesses outside the city of Seattle started calling, and police departments outside the city of Seattle started calling, including out of state. I think one of the most significant calls I got was from the police chief in Montgomery, Alabama, who heard about our program and wanted to know more information about it. That spread, through use across Canada. We have places, police departments in Los Angeles and Baltimore and Louisville, Tucson, Denver, Miami. I think the most significant department that's ever adopted our Safe Place Initiative was Orlando, on the 6-month anniversary of the Pulse nightclub shootings, in memorial to that. So I'm thrilled about the level of interest. I'm heading to Nashville on Sunday to help that department implement the Safe Place Initiative there. I work closely with the DOJ and the FBI and other entities to help educate their staff on this, and kind of track these hate crimes as they're occurring in our region as well as other regions. Because let's face it, with a lot of the rhetoric that's been going on the last couple of years, it is empowering some of these people who have literally been in the closet themselves when it comes to committing hate crimes. They're feeling more emboldened to do this now. And I think that Seattle is very prepared to be responding to this, more so than we've ever been in the past. And we're setting the example for other law enforcement agencies around the world that may want to follow in our footsteps.
And you've got now a few, or 2.5-ish years of data, I assume. So have you seen an increase in reporting? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think when you look at our Seattle Police dashboard, that from the time Safe Place launched and that public conversation started occurring, a significant increase, two, maybe a threefold increase in reporting. And the media was asking when we started doing this, well, does that mean there's more hate crimes going on? And I said, well, not necessarily. That tells me that I know they've always been going on. It's just the fact that these victims are more confident in our abilities as a police department to report it and hold these people accountable, and the public's assistance and support, that before they just weren't really exactly sure how business owners or the public felt about the LGBT community. So I think it's been a great success. I know that the police department gets inquiries constantly on this from other agencies and the news media. So we're very pleased it's going the direction it has.
And do you provide, does the police department, or through, outsourcing, or do you provide training to businesses on how to respond?
Well, the best thing about this program, when I first developed it, Chief O'Toole says, oh, this is great, but it's going to require 8 hours of training for everybody. I said, no, Chief, it's going to require about 5 minutes. I said, for this program to be effective as it has been, it has to be simple to understand and easy to train. There's only 2 requirements. The first is if a victim of any crime, especially a hate crime, comes into your business, that you're to train your employees to call 911 immediately on the victim's behalf, even if the victim doesn't want you to call. We need to know this is going on. We need to have our officers heading that direction. The second requirement is to allow the victim to remain on the premise until the police arrive. Then it's incumbent on the SPD or any department that adopts this to take the appropriate reports, get the victim the aid they need, and to make arrest or file charges against the suspects who do this. We noticed that within the first couple of weeks, which was right before the Pride festivities in 2015, we had about 8 felony assaults, which is when we normally have assaults during Pride weekend. There's 500,000 people in Seattle celebrating this. Before, a lot of them weren't being reported in a timely manner, if at all. Oftentimes the victims would just be found and we would have no idea what happened. We noticed this time after Safe Place launched that the conversation was being had. The victims reported, 8 reports occurred, resulting in 7 arrests, 2 at Safe Place locations and 1 in which the suspect was being held down by the witnesses. That told us that the community was now getting involved. Not that we want the community to go out and apprehend suspects.
Vigilante
justice
justice
happened, and it told us that, okay, there's now a shift in public awareness to this, which continues to this day.
Well, and is there so I guess for me, and maybe this is my lawyer brain working, but is there a concern that if there's a crime underway and someone runs into a Starbucks, for example, and they have a Safe Place sticker, as our Starbucks does down here, is there a concern that there's someone in pursuit of a victim and there might be an issue, or are we really saying like this is a community issue, and if there's a room full of people, that person's not going to run in?
Well, first of all, these decals that are placed on the front of these businesses have a multitude of messages to them. First of all, they let the victims know that this business is LGBTQ friendly and is there to help. It also lets the criminals who walk by these businesses know that these businesses are working with the Seattle Police Department in support of helping the victims of these crimes. When I talk to the lawyers and the legal staff at these big corporations that have joined Safe Place, that's their first concern as far as what happens if somebody comes in following the victim. Well, my response to that is the suspects who do this are mostly cowards. They hide in the shadows. They wait for the victim to walk by a dark alley. They assault them and then they leave. The last thing these suspects want is to walk into a room full of witnesses who can all point the finger in a jury trial at them and send them away for 10 years. And, we've had that happen. We've had not only a lot more local charges, but some federal charges lodged against suspects who all belong to their own criminal subculture. They all talk. And believe me, it just takes 1 or 2 suspects to be going away to prison for years, whereas before they wouldn't have received any attention on this at all, to make them wake up and realize, okay, the attitude in Seattle is changing. And now the risks are outweighing the benefits of doing this, at least in this city.
No, and just for edification to our listeners, there are 3 levels. The federal level, which Jim mentioned, is the Shepard-Byrd Act that was signed into law by President Obama. It's named for Matthew Shepard and James Byrd, individual Matthew Shepard, openly gay, who was tortured and killed in Wyoming, and James Byrd, who was summarily dismembered, being pulled by the back of a pickup truck in Texas. So, I mean, again, when we talk about crimes against individuals, some of the most heinous crimes have been occurring against individuals who identify as gay and or transgender. We know that that's the historical piece. But with respect to what I'm talking about is that you have a federal jurisdiction. You also have state law, the Felony Malicious Harassment Act, RCW 936-0. And then you have a Seattle municipal ordinance. It's a misdemeanor malicious harassment, SMC 12A.06.115, or, that is Seattle Municipal Code. But you also have two forms of reporting. I know that I looked at some of the data. You have non-criminal harassment issues, malicious harassment, and then there was the criminal aspect of it.
What we have is we have 3 categories we break down. First is malicious harassment, which is the hate crime, which is the primary motivator that a suspect has in, let's say, assaulting you because of your perceived difference. The next category we have is a crime with bias elements, which means that the primary motive may be robbery, yet the suspect makes some offhanded comment about your sexual preference or gender identity, which is unusual for a suspect to do. So when the prosecutors look at this, that may or may not be a biased crime, but our officers, we want them to report it as such. The third category, which is exclusive to Seattle, is bias incidents, which are incidents that occur when you're walking down the street, somebody makes a derogatory comment about your perceived sexual orientation, race, immigration status, whatever, which is unusual for a person to be doing. My position on that is the reason we do this is because if that person was to walk down the street again by this individual several hours later, and that individual was under the influence of alcohol or drugs, it could easily go from verbal to assault, and we already know who the suspect was. Even though they may not have committed a crime that was free speech initially, it could easily turn into a crime down the road.
That is very unique in
It
this
is.
application. I
It is.
haven't seen that anywhere.
It isn't, and as far
Yeah.
as I know, it's not done anywhere.
But in some ways, as a warning sign, right? Of
Well, it's better to be prepared for this.
Yeah.
Free speech is great until you realize down the road what it could actually turn into.
That's interesting because I just read an article about a free speech issue by a neo-Nazi harassment. It's not protected by First Amendment. This was a judge, it's Daily Stormer, which is a neo-Nazi newspaper. They were attacking this individual woman who was a real estate broker. But that's interesting. So with respect to, I want to get back to Safe Place because you also have please check the site. Go to Safe Place, Seattle Police Department. You have information regarding bullying. I know what student.
There's two components to the Safe Place initiative. The first is the hate crimes component, which is what businesses sign up for, or organizations. The second component is the anti-bullying component, where we collaborate with school districts. Because let's face it, the suspects who do this as adults usually start doing this as kids in school. And if the behavior is not addressed at the school district level or at the parent level for that matter, these kids go unchecked, they turn into adults and they continue this abusive behavior, which results in anything from assaults to harassment to murder. And that is why the Safe Place initiative is a two-pronged approach to this. And I think the more entities that are aware of this and can practice it, the safer everybody's going to be out there.
And let me say this: I worked well, actually, more than I would like to think, a few cases in Oregon regarding attacks on gay individuals. 2 of them led to suicide. I mean, that's how far it went. And so, folks, this is a serious issue. We need to take hold of this and encourage our schools to be more active and proactive about it if they aren't already. Again, one of the more difficult entities that I found to work with are some of our public agencies, school districts, but still in all, it is an issue that's got to be out there. And I'm just going to champion the work that Jim has been doing with respect to Safe Place and other organizations, but the lead has got to be what we're doing from the Seattle Police Department side here in Seattle. Go ahead, Carly. I'm sorry.
Well, just kind of continue, whether with Safe Place or any other programs you have going right now, what other work are you doing related to this?
Well, I found a lot of my work has now gone into the training venue, not only, not so much with our officers and that they have already been trained on this, but officers from around the region. I train for the State Sheriffs and Police Chiefs Association. I'm a consultant with the International Association of Chiefs of Police, which is why I was in Texas and Oklahoma, and we'll be going to Ohio and Iowa here shortly, again in Nashville next week. I was in Berlin last year at their request because they wanted more information about training their officers on this, because Europe has got the same issues that we do, and in some cases much more severe. I think in many cases Europe is more advanced on social issues than the United States is, but I found out once I got there that may not always be the case. So I think, again, it's that conversation, it's the training that goes along with it, it's the fact that the police departments are talking about this, recognizing it, the police administrators who are from my generation and younger are understanding that the more information the public gets towards this to offset a lot of the rhetoric, the happier the members of their communities will be.
And as far as the school side of things, what's the training? What's the gap, I guess, for teachers? I mean, I would like to think, and police too, for that matter, I want to think that this is part of the standard training. And so if it's not, what's the gap, and is it being filled?
Well, I think the gap that I discovered working with the Seattle Public Schools, which have adopted the Safe Place initiative, is that I always was under the assumption that the superintendent ran everything, just like the chief of police runs everything. Well, I was quickly educated in the fact that you've got, school principals that are all independent of the superintendent. You've got the PTA and other parent groups that unless all are on the same page, there's a lot of stumbling blocks to getting anything accomplished within a school district. I'm not just talking Seattle Public Schools. I'm talking about any school district I've dealt with. It's the same dynamic regardless where you go. So there's not one person in charge. There's a multitude of influences when it comes to decisions on anything that affects students.
So even if you have an administration that's interested in this kind of training or that recognizes a need for it, if you have a PTA that's absolutely against it, then you may not be able to get in there and train folks.
Yeah, and I ran across this at a school district northeast of here in the suburban area where there was a heavy influence of PTA members who belonged to a specific religious organization who did not feel that teaching their kids about this was as important as it was to other parents of students at this particular school district. So, and that's something that I can't control. I can offer the program on behalf of the Seattle Police Department. We share this program. It's, I call it our funky franchise, that we will allow any entity, police department or school district to adopt this, providing they follow our protocol. And, some can, some can't. Some it's going to take a little bit of time. Either way, the conversation is moving forward.
Jim is so diplomatic, but again, to the public schools out there, they go to this format of building-based management, and it's pretty much singular based on whatever is being managed by the principal of that building. But I think more and more people are realizing that the benefit of this program or awareness of what goes on. Again, but I try to explain to people, bullying occurs in every school practically across this country every single day. For whatever reason, it could be because gay, because you're short, tall, African-American, woman, a girl, female, it doesn't matter. It's part of that. And we've got to get a handle on it because it does have some dire consequences, as we know.
Well, when you look at it, and this is what I talk to the school districts about, is that you look at it from a social perspective, is that you're keeping your students safe when you're talking about this and establishing new protocols that have been updated since the 1960s. You also have to have in place not just protocols, but the ability to enforce those. If you have policies that aren't enforced, they really don't mean anything. And look at it from a financial perspective. When you have an incident where your student is bullied and the administration doesn't take the corrective action, you're talking about millions of dollars in lawsuits, undermining public confidence, having kids pulled out of school districts because they don't think the administration has a handle on this. And then you look at the suicide rate, you look at the rate of stress involved with a lot of these students that have blown up into far worse things, school shootings, because of the pressures that have been put on some of these students. So it's important to think about all these things.
Well, one of the things that, and having worked in the school district, one of the reasons we found out kids brought weapons to schools to protect themselves from other students because of the aspect of bullying. I mean, in every case, there was a shooting in Garfield several years ago, and the kid brought the gun to school, brought it from home because he was being bullied and harassed, being beaten up because of lunch money, being extorted. We got to deal with these issues, but thank you, Jim, on that piece. One of the things that we also talked about, Carly and I, when we got in here, we're talking about safe place. A lot of the businesses that are open up late, I encourage the businesses that I go to, to look in that program because you open up at 1 or 2 in the morning and you're in a place that serves alcohol, and alcohol almost always seems to be the catalyst for some of those antisocial behaviors. And there were a number of incidents that we're aware of that occurred on Capitol Hill. A lot of the taverns, and like you said, there is a relationship. But what role does you have the your commission, your LGBT, Seattle has the commission, correct? LGBTQ.
Well, they have the LGBTQ Advisory Council.
Advisory Council. I'm sorry, that was it. What is have they adopted a more? I know the DOJ Community Relations Service is about ready to ramp out the new revised transgender training nationally. Is there an aspect? I'm kind of breaking transgender issues away from I won't say it like that, but I'll say it like a general LGBT.
Away from the other letters?
Yeah, other
Let's
letters.
talk about the T.
Because there is an issue there.
There is.
We have a serious, please,
Well, I think when you look at transgender issues, transgender individuals had been segregated even from the gay and lesbian and bisexual communities for years. So there was discrimination from the general community. There was internal discrimination from the LGBTQ community as well. So that is now being resolved in a number of ways and manners. There's more public attention being given to this. There's more acceptance of transgender folks throughout society. We got a long ways to go, but there's an enormous amount of efforts being made, not just from government levels, but from private organizations, from radio shows like this, and other entities which are giving a lot of support to the transgender community.
And this is Transgender Awareness Week?
Transgender Day of Remembrance is going to be tomorrow night.
Okay.
For those interested, it's going to be at the Seattle Central University around 5:30. I'll be there, as well as a number of members of the Seattle's transgender community, and love to see you there.
Yeah. You had a question or anything? I'm sorry. We're going to be wrapping
We're just
it up.
about to wrap up here. So we just wanted to really thank you for taking the time. And I guess if there's, kind of one last event or one more thing or place we can go for information, that would be helpful to share.
I direct everybody to our website at spdsafeplace.com. We're about ready to launch our new website next week. And it'll give you all the information you possibly need, including my contact information and how to become a member of the Safe Place Initiative.
Yeah, they don't. I mean, your name is in there. And I'm sorry, I can barely read it. It is very important. Jim, thanks a lot. And real quick, Police Museum. I wanted to ask about that. I was the operation real quick.
Well, we had to shut the museum down last year for structural reasons for the building.
Right in that building, yeah.
Yeah, we will be looking for a new location. We've been up for 20 years and plan on being in existence for another, as long as I'm alive anyway. We're still restoring the old police cars and providing the public with information about police history in Seattle. So we'll let you know more when we move forward later on this year.
That's an aside, but I had to get that plug in. Well, thank you very much, James Ritter, Seattle Police Department Liaison, LGBTQ Liaison. Carly Summers, my co-host. You're listening to Seattle Here and Now on Rainier Avenue Radio.world. We are closing out. Thank you very much for listening.
This is Paul Pearson, host of Star Time. And when I'm not explaining to my intern exactly